Part 1, Dramatic Hook, 250 words. At 0640 hours on October 25, 1944, the crew of USS St. Lo, an American Casablanca-class escort carrier, scanned the sky for familiar threats: enemy bombers, torpedo planes, and the ever-present Mitsubishi A6M0, codenamed Zeke by Allied intelligence. American pilots, hardened by months of combat, dismissed reports of Japanese suicide tactics as desperate rumors. In pre-dawn briefings, flight officers joked about crazy pilots with no bombs, and even after Admiral Thomas L. Sprague's task unit April 3, 77, known as Taffy 3, had suffered relentless attacks at Leyte Gulf, the mood was skeptical. The official tally: 16 escort carriers, 6 battleships, and 7 cruisers in the 7th Fleet's vicinity. 15,000 sailors manned the ships, with over 200 aircraft on deck or circling above. Then, within a single hour, disbelief vanished. 24 Japanese Zeros, each stripped of excess weight, loaded with 550-pound bombs, and flown by men of the Special Attack Unit (DOV) with lethal precision. At 1,050 hours, one Zero struck USS St. Lo at the waterline. Its bomb detonated inside the hangar, igniting fuel and ordnance. Within minutes, fires raged across the deck. St. Lo lost power. Multiple explosions tore her apart. 143 American sailors perished. 5 more ships, including USS Santee and USS Sewanee, suffered direct hits. In just 60 minutes, kamikaze attacks destroyed or crippled more vessels than any previous single-hour assault in the Pacific. The unexpected factor, the first organized kamikaze wave, dismissed as laughable, had instantly rewritten the rules of naval warfare with catastrophic consequences. Part 2, Historical Setup, 350 words. At precisely 0500 hours on October 25, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf entered its decisive phase off Samar Island in the Philippine archipelago. Rear Admiral Clifton A. F. Sprague, commanding Task Unit April 3, 77, Taffy 3, positioned his force of 6 escort carriers, including USS St. Lo, CV-63, USS Santee, CV-29, and USS Sewanee, CV-27, in support of General Douglas MacArthur's ongoing landings on Leyte. Sprague's carriers, protected by Destroyer Squadron 61 and Destroyer Escort Division 66, operated 30 miles east of the invasion beaches. The Japanese First Air Fleet, under Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, had assembled a new special attack unit at Mabalacat Airfield on Luzon. At 0645 hours, Lieutenant Yukio Seiki led a detachment of 5 A6M0 aircraft, each modified to carry a single 550-pound bomb. These Zeros, stripped of non-essential gear to maximize speed and maneuverability, launched on the first organized suicide mission in Japanese military history. The A6M0 Zeke featured a 940 horsepower Nakajima Sakai 12 radial engine, a maximum speed of 331 miles per hour, and an operational range of 1,930 miles with drop tanks. The aircraft's lightweight construction lacks self-sealing fuel tanks and armor, making it vulnerable but highly agile. For this mission, pilots carried only enough fuel for a one-way trip. On the American side, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland of USS Samuel B. Roberts, DE-413, coordinated anti-aircraft defenses as radar screens lit up with inbound contacts. Pilots from Composite Squadron VC-65 scrambled FM-2 Wildcat fighters with .50 caliber Browning machine guns to intercept. The fleet's radar operators tracked multiple bogies approaching from the northwest at altitudes between 5,000 and 8,000 feet. Geographically, the Leyte Gulf Theater placed the U.S. fleet directly between the Japanese-held airfields of Luzon and the Allied beachhead. The distance from Mabalacat to the Taffy 3 formation measured about 270 miles, well within the Zero's range for a one-way attack. The technical convergence of carrier aviation, radar-guided defense, and unprecedented suicide tactics set the stage for a historic confrontation. Part 3, Rising Tension, 300 words. At 0645 hours, Lieutenant Yukio Seiki's flight lifted off from Mabalacat Airfield, each Zero's bomb slung beneath its fuselage. By 0730 hours, U.S. radar operators aboard USS St. Lo and USS Kalinan Bay, CVE-68, detected multiple unidentified contacts closing from bearing 315 degrees. At 0802 hours, anti-aircraft crews aboard USS Santee stood to battle stations as incoming aircraft split into 2 groups, one feinting toward the north, the other diving from the west. From the Allied command perspective, Vice Admiral Thomas L. Sprague monitored chaotic radio traffic as pilots reported enemy planes closing fast. At 0850 hours, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland aboard USS Samuel B. Roberts relayed multiple Zeeks, low altitude, closing in, request immediate fighter cover. On the flight deck, Ensign Robert Brown of Composite Squadron VC-65 launched in his FM-2 Wildcat, his radio crackling with calls for intercept vectors. Aboard the attacking Zeros, pilots of the Special Attack Unit maintained strict radio silence. Lieutenant Saki's group descended below 6,000 feet, using cloud cover to mask their approach. At 0931 hours, lookouts on USS Sewanee identified 4 Zeros lining up for attack runs. The first Kamikaze smashed into the flight deck at 0939 hours, detonating its bomb and starting a massive blaze. By 0956 hours, USS St. Louis lookouts spotted 3 more Zeros diving from 2,000 feet. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, but the attackers pressed on. At exactly 1,051 hours, a Zero scored a direct hit on St. Louis, its 550-pound bomb penetrating the hangar deck and triggering catastrophic explosions. Within 10 minutes, St. Louis began listing heavily, her fate sealed. Japanese and American eyewitnesses alike reported the speed, accuracy, and determination of the first kamikaze wave, forcing Allied sailors to confront a new, deadly reality in the Pacific theater. In the hours following USS St. Louis sinking, the sea around her was littered with oil, wreckage, and hundreds of sailors struggling for survival. Rescue destroyers, including USS Dennis and USS Raymond, braved fires and sporadic air attacks to haul men from the water. On the battered decks of USS Sewanee, corpsmen tended to burn victims, many of whom had only moments earlier been engaged in desperate firefighting efforts. The stench of burning fuel and cordite lingered as damage control parties worked feverishly to contain secondary blazes on several escort carriers. News of the attack spread rapidly through the U.S. 7th Fleet. By nightfall, surviving officers from St. Louis were debriefed on the destroyer USS Claxton, relaying their accounts to Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. In hastily convened wardrooms, senior commanders pored over early reports, trying to make sense of an enemy tactic that defied established doctrine. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, now recovering from shrapnel wounds aboard USS John C. Butler, described the confusion on the airwaves as unlike any engagement fought before. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, Japanese naval strategists celebrated the outcome as radio broadcasts trumpeted the glorious sacrifice of the Special Attack Unit. At the Imperial General Headquarters, Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi reviewed after-action messages, noting with satisfaction the psychological impact on the enemy. For the first time, Japanese high command saw hope in a war increasingly defined by defeat. On the U.S. side, intelligence officers quickly pieced together the new threat. By October 26, intercepted communications and pilot reports confirmed that the Americans had faced not isolated suicide attacks, but a deliberate, coordinated campaign. Rear Admiral Jesse B. Oldendorf, in command of the 7th Fleet's bombardment group, issued a stark warning: be prepared for further attacks of this nature. No ship is immune. Back at Leyte Gulf, exhausted sailors reinforced anti-aircraft watches, while chaplains led memorial services for the hundreds lost in the surprise onslaught. Among the wreckage, divers recovered fragments of Japanese aircraft, their fuselages riddled with bullet holes but driven home with terrifying precision. For many survivors, the events of October 25 would mark a turning point and end to any illusions of a conventional enemy. In the days that followed, the Allies scrambled to assess the scope of the kamikaze threat. Naval intelligence in Pearl Harbor sent urgent cables to Washington, D.C., warning Japanese employing suicide tactics on large scale. Immediate countermeasures required. Across the Pacific, carrier task forces altered their patrol patterns, and damage control drills became a daily ritual. As November approached, both sides braced for a new, more brutal phase of the Pacific War. The emergence of organized kamikaze tactics forced Allied planners to confront a challenge unlike any previously encountered in naval warfare. Technical analysis of the attacks revealed the limitations of existing shipboard defenses. Although anti-aircraft gunners had downed several incoming Zeros, the sheer speed and determination of the pilots often rendered defensive firepower insufficient. Investigations by the Bureau of Ships determined that a single well-placed bomb, delivered by a committed attacker, could inflict catastrophic damage on even the most modern escort carriers. Comparisons were swiftly drawn to earlier Japanese suicide attacks, such as the ramming of USS Smith by a burning Betty bomber off Guadalcanal in 1942. However, the scale and coordination at Leyte Gulf represented a qualitative leap. Unlike isolated acts of desperation, the special attack units operated under centralized command, with pilots given explicit orders to crash their aircraft into enemy vessels. Analysts also noted the use of cloud cover in feint attacks, designed to fragment Allied fighter defenses and exploit gaps in radar coverage. Naval historians later observed that the Kamikaze campaign marked the first time an adversary had weaponized the concept of total commitment as a formal doctrine. The psychological effect on Allied crews was profound. Interviews with survivors of St. Lo and Sewanee revealed a new sense of vulnerability. Sailors spoke of the implacable resolve of the attackers, and the dread of an enemy who would not break off, no matter the odds. Strategically, the kamikaze threat forced a rapid evolution in defensive tactics. Fleet commanders began to re-examine the big blue blanket approach, deploying continuous combat air patrols at greater distances from the fleet, and integrating picket destroyers as early warning nodes. Radar operators were trained to distinguish suicide aircraft from conventional attackers, and fire control officers experimented with concentrated barrages, hoping to disrupt incoming pilots before they could lock onto a target. Expert assessments at the time were divided. Some, like Captain Arleigh Burke, argued that superior American air cover and improved coordination would eventually neutralize the kamikaze threat. Others, including British observers in the Royal Navy, warned that the tactic could cause unacceptable losses if not decisively countered. Evidence from the aftermath at Leyte underscored both positions. While most kamikazes were shot down before reaching their targets, those that got through inflicted disproportionate casualties. In the weeks after Leyte Gulf, the ripple effects of the kamikaze attacks reverberated through every level of Allied command. Admiral William F. Halsey ordered an immediate review of fleet dispositions, instructing carrier task groups to disperse at greater intervals to minimize the risk of multiple ships being hit in a single attack. New standing orders mandated that all ships maintain maximum readiness during daylight hours, with anti-aircraft crews on continuous alert. Communications protocols were overhauled to reduce confusion during attacks. Task force commanders introduced a standardized system of alerts. Condition red was now broadcast fleet-wide at the first sign of inbound enemy aircraft. Meanwhile, shipboard chaplains, psychologists, and medical officers worked overtime to address the mounting strain on crews exposed to repeated suicide assaults. Allied planners also accelerated the deployment of new defensive technologies. Proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells began arriving in forward areas, while fighter squadrons were retrained to intercept low-flying attackers before they could begin their final dives. Destroyer screens were thickened around carriers, and new tactics emphasized aggressive counterattacks against suspected kamikaze airfields. On the Japanese side, the apparent success at Leyte Gulf emboldened commanders to expand the special attack units. Recruitment drives drew hundreds of new volunteers, many barely out of flight school. At bases across Luzon and Kyushu, pilots underwent crash courses in navigation and attack procedures, their instructors emphasizing the sacred duty of the kamikaze. New types of suicide craft, including the rocket-powered Oka, were rushed into production. As November 1944 dawned, both sides understood that the war in the Pacific had entered a new and deadly phase. The kamikaze threat, once unthinkable, was now a daily reality. For Allied sailors, every dawn brought the fear of another attack from the sky. For Japanese commanders, the tactic offered a fleeting hope of turning the tide, even as losses mounted. The battle lines, physical and psychological, were redrawn, setting the stage for even fiercer confrontations in the months to come. Part 1: Lesser-known details. The weeks following Leyte Gulf saw the Pacific War shift in ways rarely captured by headlines or official communiques. On the decks of ammunition ships like the USS Mount Hood, sailors coped with a new, grinding anxiety not just of enemy attack, but of sheer logistical strain. Seaman First Class Luis Herrera, in a letter smuggled past censors, described how the endless loading and unloading never stops. "We sleep in snatches, with the clang of shells and the stink of cordite, always half waiting for the next alarm." The mounting tempo of kamikaze raids forced supply ships to loiter at greater distances from the front, stretching delivery schedules and leading to shortages of fuel, shells, and even fresh water aboard forward-deployed vessels. Behind the scenes, fleet quartermasters confronted a daunting arithmetic. A classified December 1944 memo from Commander Service Squadron 10 noted, replacement gun barrels and ammunition expenditures now exceed pre-campaign estimates by 40%. Resupply convoys are at risk due to enemy air activity. Recommend additional escort resources. These mundane but vital calculations often determined whether a destroyer could keep its guns firing or a carrier could launch its planes. Yet, official records sometimes painted a rosier picture than reality. After-action reports habitually undercounted the number of near misses or downplayed the psychological costs on exhausted gun crews. Lieutenant J.G. Ruth Okamura, a Navy nurse stationed at a field hospital on Samar, wrote in her diary, "The men arrived glassy-eyed, hands shaking, unable to recall their own names after days at general quarters. The officers say battle fatigue is under control, but we see it every day." Environmental factors added another layer of complexity. The typhoon season of late 1944 brought towering seas and unpredictable squalls, which sometimes grounded Japanese sorties but also battered Allied ships, leaving them vulnerable and scattered. On December 18, a sudden storm, later classified as Typhoon Cobra, caught a task group off guard, capsizing 3 destroyers and damaging numerous other vessels. In the chaos, radar tracking was disrupted, and several Allied ships reported false alarms, mistaking wind-driven debris for incoming aircraft. On the Japanese side, fuel shortages became critical. Many kamikaze pilots soared aloft with barely enough aviation gasoline to reach their targets, let alone return. In a letter recovered from a downed Oka pilot, Yoshitaka Yamada confessed, "We are told to conserve every drop. There is no practice, only one flight, the last." The stark contrast between official doctrine and ground-level improvisation was never more apparent. Meticulously scripted attacks devolved into desperate, often chaotic, lunges against overwhelming odds. Part 2: Historian Perspectives. For decades, the Kamikaze campaign has occupied a contested space in the annals of World War II scholarship. Early post-war narratives, shaped by Allied military reports and the memoirs of senior commanders, tended to treat the phenomenon as an act of desperation, a last resort that, while horrifying, posed no fundamental threat to Allied victory. Popular histories of the 1950s and 60s often drew a straight line between kamikaze tactics and the perceived fanaticism of the Japanese military, reinforcing stereotypes without probing deeper motives or ramifications. It was not until the 1970s, as Japanese archives began to open and survivor testimony grew more accessible, that a more nuanced picture emerged. Historians like Dr. Saburo Ayanaga challenged the notion of kamikaze operations as mere suicide missions, emphasizing instead the complex interplay of nationalism, coercion, and youthful idealism. Declassified Imperial Navy documents revealed debates among Japanese officers, some advocating for targeted, strategic use of suicide aircraft, others urging mass attacks regardless of cost. The release of Allied intelligence intercepts in the 1990s further complicated the narrative. Newly analyzed ultra-decrypt showed how much the Allies knew about Japanese preparations, sometimes allowing them to pre-position defenses or anticipate peak attack periods. This, in turn, cast doubt on earlier claims that kamikaze waves were always unpredictable. Today, academic debate centers on the psychology of the pilots and the effectiveness of their missions. Some scholars, drawing on oral histories, argue that the kamikaze program was less monolithic than previously thought. Many pilots volunteered under social pressure or outright coercion, while others left behind letters expressing ambivalence, doubt, or even quiet resistance. Meanwhile, recent statistical analyses suggest that although kamikaze attacks sank relatively few large ships, they inflicted outsized damage on smaller craft and support vessels, with ripple effects on the pace and logistics of the Allied advance. The evolving historiography reflects a broader understanding that the kamikaze campaign was not simply a military tactic, but a tragic intersection of strategy, ideology, and the human costs of modern war. Part 3: Human Stories. Consider the trajectory of Petty Officer Second Class Harold Hal Dandridge, a radar technician aboard the USS Laffey. Raised in rural Oklahoma, Dandridge enlisted in 1942, driven by newsreels and the promise of adventure. By early 1945, his days were spent in the ship's cramped radar shack, eyes glued to phosphor screens, deciphering friend from foe. In a rare interview years later, Dandridge recalled, "We'd watch the blips coming in, faster than we could count. You couldn't help but think, does that one have my name on it?" After the war, Dandridge struggled with nightmares and bouts of what would now be recognized as PTSD. He found solace as a teacher in his hometown, quietly mentoring students, rarely speaking of the war except to say, "You do what you must, then you live with it." On the Japanese side, the story of Midshipman Fumio Tamura offers a different window into the conflict. Born in Kochi Prefecture, Tamura was a university student drafted into the Special Attack Corps in late 1944. His diary, rediscovered by his family decades later, chronicles his transformation from idealistic youth to reluctant warrior. "They say our sacrifice will save Japan," he wrote in December 1944. "But I see only sorrow in my mother's eyes." Tamura's final mission ended when his aircraft malfunctioned. He crash-landed and was captured by American forces. After years in a POW camp, he returned to post-war Japan a changed man, dedicating his life to peace activism and speaking in schools about the realities of war. A third perspective comes from Lieutenant Ann Creighton, an Army nurse stationed at a field hospital near Tacloban. Born in Philadelphia, Creighton was one of the first American women to arrive in the Philippines after Lady. Her letters home recount the relentless influx of burn victims and shrapnel wounds, but also moments of quiet resilience. "We cannot undo what is done," she wrote in January 1945, "but we can hold a hand, write a letter for a wounded boy, offer a smile in the dark." After the war, Creighton became a leading advocate for veterans' mental health, pushing for greater recognition of invisible wounds. For each of these individuals, the Kamikaze campaign was more than a headline or a statistic. It was a crucible that forged, scarred, and ultimately reshaped their lives. Their stories remind us that the currents of history are carried forward not only by grand strategy, but by the endurance of ordinary people. Part 1: Strategic Consequences. In the immediate aftermath of the Kamikaze campaign's peak, Allied commanders initiated a series of swift tactical adjustments. Damage control protocols were overhauled aboard every ship in the Pacific Fleet. New drills for rapid firefighting, crew evacuation, and emergency repairs became daily routines. Anti-aircraft gunners received updated targeting instructions, while radar picket ships, now recognized as critical early warning nodes, were reinforced with additional escorts and improved communication links. The intensity of the threat forced a redistribution of ships, with valuable carriers and troop transports positioned further from likely attack vectors, surrounded by layered defensive screens. Within weeks, operational doctrines shifted. Amphibious landings, once timed to daylight for logistical ease, were increasingly staged under cover of darkness or poor weather, exploiting the kamikaze pilots' limited visibility and navigation. The U.S. Navy accelerated the rollout of proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells and improved fighter direction tactics, closing the brief window of vulnerability that suicide attackers had exploited. Airfields on newly captured islands were prioritized for rapid expansion, allowing patrols and interceptors to respond more quickly to inbound threats. By the end of several months, these adaptations yielded measurable results. The frequency of successful kamikaze strikes declined, and the survival rates of damaged ships improved. Supply convoys reached their destinations with greater reliability, and the tempo of the Allied advance regained momentum. Yet, the psychological aftermath lingered. Crews rotated off the front lines reported higher rates of combat fatigue, while command staff debated how to prepare for even more desperate measures should the war continue onto the Japanese home islands. In the years that followed, the lessons of the Kamikaze campaign permeated naval strategy worldwide. Ship design underwent a transformation, with reinforced decks, improved compartmentalization, and centralized firefighting systems becoming industry standards. Military planners across nations studied the psychological dimensions of suicide tactics, prompting new approaches to crew training, resilience, and intelligence analysis. The memory of those months, when the sky itself seemed to rain destruction, shaped doctrines from the Cold War to the modern era, influencing everything from missile defense to counterterrorism strategies. The campaign's reverberations, both material and moral, extended far beyond the Pacific, altering the calculus of warfare for generations. Part 2: Turning Point Analysis. Had the Kamikaze campaign never materialized, the final year of the Pacific War might have unfolded very differently. Allied planners, untested by the grim calculus of mass suicide attacks, could have maintained bolder amphibious operations with less caution, risking greater concentrations of troops and ships in exposed anchorages. Without the impetus provided by these assaults, the accelerated development and deployment of advanced shipboard defenses such as proximity fuses and improved radar coordination might have lagged, leaving fleets more vulnerable to conventional air raids or submarine threats. Comparisons to similar episodes in military history, such as Germany's V-weapon attacks or the massed banzai charges on Saipan and Iwo Jima, reveal both parallels and stark contrasts. Unlike those earlier efforts, the Kamikaze campaign forced a paradigm shift, the recognition that technological superiority alone could not guarantee invulnerability, and that morale, on both sides, could be a decisive factor. Allied after-action reports from late 1944 and 1945 frequently cite the psychological weight of anticipating unrelenting, seemingly irrational assaults, a burden rarely encountered in previous conflicts. Over decades, historian consensus has evolved from dismissing the kamikaze tactic as mere desperation to acknowledging its calculated, if ultimately flawed, strategic logic. Early post-war narratives, colored by the trauma of surviving sailors and sensational media accounts, emphasized the futility and fanaticism of suicide attacks. Later scholarship, informed by Japanese archival releases and oral histories, reframed the campaign as a deliberate, if costly, attempt to alter the balance of power through asymmetric means. Today, the prevailing view regards the kamikaze program as a complex response to strategic encirclement, shaped by a volatile mix of technological limits, cultural imperatives, and battlefield realities. As new sources emerged and the veterans' voices were finally heard, understanding of the campaign's significance deepened. What once seemed an inexplicable anomaly is now recognized as a pivotal moment, a crucible that forced tactical innovation, revealed the limits of coercive ideology, and left an indelible mark on the conduct of modern war. Part 3: Legacy and Memorial. In the decades that followed, those who survived the crucible of the kamikaze campaign charted divergent paths. Some, like the radar technician from the USS Laffey, quietly rebuilt their lives, their wartime experiences surfacing only in moments of reflection or when supporting fellow veterans. Others, including former Japanese pilots and nurses, became public advocates, channeling their memories into efforts for reconciliation and peace. Across the Pacific, small reunions and correspondences endured, fragments of a shared history that transcended former enmities. The physical legacy of the campaign is preserved in museums and memorials on both sides of the ocean. In Japan, the Chiran Peace Museum stands as a testament to the young pilots, displaying diaries, letters, and photographs that humanize the faces behind the aircraft. In the United States, memorial plaques aboard preserved ships and at naval bases commemorate the sailors and airmen who faced the storm. Annual ceremonies bring together families, veterans, and historians to honor sacrifice and reflect on the enduring costs of war. The impact of the kamikaze campaign continues to shape military doctrine. Modern navies train for asymmetric threats, whether from unmanned drones, missile swarms, or cyber attacks, with an acute awareness of how innovation and desperation can upend the balance of power. Psychological resilience, once an afterthought, is now woven into the fabric of military training and support. The legacy endures in the quiet moments, when a ship's bell tolls, when a diary page is turned, when a survivor's story is retold to a new generation. The kamikaze campaign's shadow, both somber and instructive, remains a permanent fixture in the annals of war, a reminder that the boundaries of human endurance and ingenuity are tested most fiercely in the crucible of conflict. Today, every major navy in the world equips its ships with layered, integrated defense systems, descendants of those first desperate adaptations, testament to a time when survival depended on learning, adapting, and remembering.